us, but makes good headway, and we will always say we did it Medway.
Hi, I'm Rob Flood.
And I'm Philip Dodd. And this is the very first episode of our brand new podcast, We Did It Medway. It's a fresh way to look at and listen to the culture, the history and the character of Medway.
We call it a quirky, respectfully irreverent celebration of the best of the Medway towns. So we've got Strood and Rochester, Chatham and Gillingham, and not forgetting...
Never forgetting...
Rainham or the Peninsula, come to that.
So we've been out and about finding people with some great tales to tell, and right now we're down here, appropriately, next to the Medway, on the esplanade just by the bridge between Rochester and Strood.
We're also excited because in just a few weeks' time it's the general election, so there's definitely a sense of anticipation and change in the air, which makes it even better that in this first episode we have Kelly Tolhurst, our sitting MP for Rochester and Strood, and Lauren Edwards, her Labour opponent. But they're not slugging it out about immigration or inflation or the NHS. They've put party politics to one side to talk about why, 100 years and more after women got the vote, women in Parliament are still getting boorish, sexist abuse from their colleagues, let alone much worse from online trolls.
So this was all inspired by the garden we're standing next to, the Suffrage Sensory Garden that's going to be dedicated on the 20th of July. And we're right next to some gorgeous plants, purple alliums, light yellow curry plants. If you ever pop down here, crumble those between your fingers and you'll know why they're called curry plants. We've got rosemary, we've got thyme, we've got oregano. It's fabulous. It all celebrates women's suffrage and is the brainchild of Natalie Poulton, who lives on the esplanade. So let's find out from Natalie exactly how this all came about.
I've lived in the area for about 18 years now, and this garden, ever since I came here, has been rather neglected and sad. There was box and huge plants, and every year the council came in, took it down to a level, and then went off again. And it just seemed a little bit of a waste.
So was it the fact that you wanted to do something with the garden, or was it the suffrage connection that came first?
I didn't realise that we could do something with the garden initially, and started looking into Vera Conway Gordon, who I found an absolutely fascinating character, who lived in Longley House, which is a centre building overlooking these gardens.
Yeah, if we're looking up here from the esplanade, there's to the right of the castle you've got three houses. The one on the far right is Satis House, which is the kind of head office of King's School. The one on the left is Whitefriars, and then in the middle, slightly off-white, beige colour, is Longley House.
So you approached the council to say, can we do something with this?
Yes, and so with the support of the Medway Urban Green Spaces Forum, I was encouraged to take this further and initially approached the Riverside housing development, knowing that they had to put some money into the local area. And then was luckily enough able to team up with some other local residents and created the Force, the Friends of Rochester's Churchfield and Esplanade, with a view to not only creating this sensory garden, but also looking after the whole green space area for the benefit of residents and visitors alike.
This was sometimes known as the Peace Garden, is that right? And that's because of the shape.
So yes, from aerial photographs, you can see that it looks rather like the old CND sign that's familiar to many people.
Tell us about some of the plants that you have here.
We have a complete range of plants, from herbs and sensory plants such as rosemary, lavender, sage, thyme. We've also got lots of allium, which will come up later in the year. These are related to onion and garlic. They're not actually edible, but they look wonderful. And some are red, most of them are purple, but some of them are red, because we wanted to celebrate the colours of both the suffragettes, the familiar violet, green and white, and the suffragists, who were red, green and white. Okay. So that's the colour scheme really
you're
stuck
using?
With those colours across the board.
Brilliant.
Also to harmonise the two factions in these gardens.
I love the idea that the Peace Garden is still reflecting harmony between the two suffrage factions.
Yeah, I was surprised to hear that things might not have been all that peaceful in the Conway Gordon house because of that.
The Medway towns were a real hotbed of suffrage campaigning. So there were the suffragettes that everyone knows about, they were all purple, smashed windows, chained themselves to railings, and the suffragists, who were law-abiding, peaceful campaigners for the vote for women and for equality. Vera Conway-Gordon was on the law-abiding team. However, Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughter, they came and they spoke at Northgate, they came and spoke at the Corn Exchange. There were riots in Gillingham, I think. And there was also an anti-suffrage society for people who didn't think that women should get the vote, unsurprisingly.
I've never heard of that.
Vera's mother was one of the founder members.
Of the anti-suffrage?
Yes.
Okay. So it was slightly tense in the...
I imagine they would be making...
Conway-Gordon
time.
Yes.
Yeah, would have, yeah.
So we're now in what we like to call Studio B for the podcast, which happens to be high up on the bluff overlooking the Medway. So a similar, but not exactly the same view as Vera Conway-Gordon would have had of the river. And we're just going to talk a little bit now about Vera and her life and the story behind her involvement in the suffragists. So, Natalie, if you just tell us a little bit about her family background, because I think she came from quite a privileged background. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, I think very well connected. Vera was born in Multan in India, which is now Pakistan, and I believe grew up there. She had two brothers, but a sister who died young. And I guess that both the brothers went off into the army, which is very typical of that sort of strata of society at the time. But Vera, her and her family moved to Rochester and leased Longley House because her father was taking some time off from his work in the civil service because he'd ruined his eyes with too much hard work. She spent a couple of years at Rochester Grammar School for Girls. In 1885, all gentlemen over the age of 21 got the vote for the first time, and this ended up in not a landslide election, but the Liberal Party suddenly became huge. Women started to take more and more of an interest in why couldn't they have some kind of a say in what was happening to them and their community. Why leave it all to the men? In November 1910, the campaign for women's suffrage had really taken off. It had been around for about 40 or 50 years, but it was now starting to really become something. That was followed by, I think it was 300 suffragettes descending upon Westminster, culminating in Black Friday.
This was the Women's Social and Political Union.
That's right,
correct?
Who later became the more militant group that we all remember from school. We were told about the suffragettes who chained themselves to railings and smashed windows and did all sorts of things, but we were never told about the law-abiding suffragists who were so important to the change in women and the vote generally.
One of Vera's peaceful actions was leading the Medway section of the NUWSS Great Pilgrimage in July 1913. Suffragists took various routes through Kent to converge in Tunbridge before heading to London, bringing the message of law-abiding campaigning to the county. In photographs of the event, Vera can be seen with a large placard as the group marched from Star Hill to the cathedral.
The women walked, cycled, rode and drove. Some had caravans, some had horses. Vera quite possibly had a bicycle because she was a very, very keen cyclist, and made their way to London. It's one of those stories that really needs to be told now as to how, I think, overall both factions were very influential in what eventually happened. But it's just that there is more than one way to win an argument, I think. Both the WSPU and the NUWSS ceased their campaigning for the duration of the war. The NUWSS threw all their efforts into relief and assistance for women and children. Particularly, Vera set up a club for servicemen's wives and their families in Strood. And there's an advert in one of the local papers where she's asking for assistance. She sets this up. It's very, very successful.
So then, end of the war, 1918, we have the Representation of the People Act.
That was passed by a coalition government, so men over the age of 21 and women over the age of 30 who had to meet some property requirements. So Vera, aged 43, didn't qualify. She didn't get the vote. In 1928, her mother dies, and so Vera has to move to Tankerton because her father's pension has presumably run out. And she moves to Tankerton near Whitstable and takes on a little bungalow. And she also has to start to earn a living for the first time in her life. So yes, she would have got the vote in the Representation of People Equal Franchise Act in 1928, which gave equal vote to all men and women over the age of 21.
Aside from her political interest, Vera was also an active member in Rochester's cultural life. She was a member of the Dickens Fellowship and also the Rochester Dickens Players.
She gave lectures and directed and appeared in numerous productions over the years, usually playing the principal, often male lead.
Well, she played the part of Uriah Heep, and I mean, we're talking about big David Copperfield, big characters, Barnaby Rudge. I mean, that's quite amazing.
And in one review, she's described as a striking figure in armour, giving a masterly interpretation of the leading role. She must have been a formidable lady.
Bearing in mind that she never married, and here we have her playing male parts in Dickens plays. I'm guessing there might be a question mark over her sexuality.
I suppose there must be. I don't think that we have any evidence to actually verify this, but in the 1939 register taken just after the outbreak of the Second World War, she is living in her little bungalow in Tankerton with a Miss Rose Carter, who's a retired governess, also a spinster, 15 years her senior.
So, wind the clock forward, and 1955, Vera passes away.
Yeah, Vera lived to be a ripe old age of 82 and sadly died just a few weeks before her birthday in Whitstable Hospital. And despite her lifetime of campaigning for women's rights, having published 3 novels, having started a career in her late 50s, and always being really active within the local community, her occupation on her death certificate is recorded as spinster daughter of. And that was the moment when I got the death certificate, I saw that and I knew that I had to do something.
Sad in a way that after all her campaigning, Vera didn't get to vote. But her work for women's suffrage paved the way for what we see here today, women playing a vital role in Medway politics, from the council all the way up to the Houses of Parliament.
Lauren Edwards is the councillor for Rochester East and Warren Wood, and she's going to be standing in the upcoming general election for Labour in the hope of representing Rochester and Strood.
I'd always sort of seen myself as somebody who worked in politics and was interested in politics, but was sort of a backroom person rather than somebody who was necessarily going to stand as a candidate. But during the pandemic, I was sort of watching Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock, and I think it's safe to say I wasn't terribly impressed, and I felt there'd been a real lack of integrity in public life. And I thought, well, do you know what? You're nearly 40. You know, you've got experience. You've got, you've got the background. You've got politics as things that you want to do, and you're not seeing them done. So rather than just complaining about it every night on the telly when you're watching the news and you're seeing this stuff, like maybe put yourself forward and go and do something about it. So I definitely wasn't thinking it would be Parliament at that. It was more just representing my local area, getting a bit of an understanding of what local government was like. It was only when I started to realise that I enjoyed that actually more than my day job that I started to think that maybe Parliament was something that I could consider. So right up until early last year, I hadn't really considered it seriously.
And I found a quote that when you were speaking to Kent Online.
Oh yeah, I think this is the one that's going to haunt me if I do get elected
Exactly.
for the next 5 years.
Let's get it over and done with, shall we?
This is why people don't make jokes when they're politicians.
So this is the one, right? So you're talking to Robert Boddy, Kent Online, and you said, I never thought about standing myself when I worked there in the House of Commons, right? I actually thought people who decided to stand for Parliament were not of sound mind. But obviously there was something there that you'd observed when you were in the House of Commons. What did you observe?
Well, it's a deeply strange place to work. It's not like any other workplace. You know, it has some of those kind of the way it operates, some of its traditions are very of the kind of British public school, which is not anything that I was familiar with. So it is a strange place, and it's, logically it's not the job that you would go for if you're thinking like, a rational person. There are better paid jobs, there are jobs with fewer hours, far less scrutiny. So if you're looking at it as a kind of objective decision, you probably wouldn't go for it.
And when you were working there, what did you observe about the way women MPs were treated?
So, I mean, I was quite lucky because we'd had in '97 the Blair's Babes. I mean, you know, the name is telling you something right there. But it meant that there were a lot more women than there had been previously, and I'd worked for only women Labour MPs who were part of sort of Harriet Harman's group of people who were working on really landmark pieces of legislation like the Equality Act. So it felt for me quite supportive, but it is a very blokey environment, and you know, you do have those instances where, you know, you definitely felt that women's voices were being marginalised or not necessarily treated with the same level of respect that male voices were. But I think you do get that in every workforce, unfortunately. I think it's not distinct in that.
Lauren's opponent in the upcoming election is Conservative MP Kelly Tolhurst, who represents Rochester and Strood. Another Medway woman who's got further than Vera could ever have imagined as she fought for voting equality.
First of all, I think someone like me to become a Member of Parliament in the first place just shows you how far we've come. My family obviously are from the Medway towns, and you know, when I look back, as you know, in the time of the suffrage movement, my ancestors locally were, you know, in service and doing other things. So for me to have come from that background to become a Member of Parliament is quite significant, and I carry that sort of awe really of the people that have come before me and who have given me the opportunity as a female today. I'm actually the 447th female MP to have been elected to Parliament, and currently now there's 229 female MPs out of 650, and that's changed dramatically. So in my lifetime, in my 45 years, you know, that's increased significantly. I think there are about 19 or something like that just prior to me being born. So, you know, it's changed dramatically, and quite rightly so.
Along the way, Kelly has drawn on the support of fellow women within her party. Among those is Baroness Anne Jenkin, who continues working to try and get more women involved and participating in Parliament.
So Baroness Jenkins is a force in the sense that, you know, she is just an absolute inspiration really to many of my colleagues and women that have come through the Conservative Party. Her and Theresa May obviously set up the Women to Win, and you know, the whole focus of the project is to be able to make sure that women are in a position so they can actually stand as candidates. Anne worked with me after the by-election, ahead of the 2015 election, and really it was just a support. I could ask them questions, they also helped me with some campaigning, and just really that sort of network, and also put me in touch with other female Conservative MPs who, because I hadn't wanted to become an MP prior to that, I didn't have those contacts. But Women to Win were able to help me meet those current female MPs and sort of get some advice from them.
One of the things I find interesting about Rochester and Medway in particular is that we have quite a tradition of female MPs. So your fellow MP for Chatham and Alresford, Tracy. But then if we wind the clock back, we had Peggy Fenner, who was MP here for a very long period of time. Before Peggy, we had Anne Kerr, who was an amazing Labour MP. So, yeah, we've got a very proud tradition here of female representation, which I think is fantastic.
Well, and I think that's because Medway creates strong women. That's it. I have to say, I haven't really felt that I am in a minority in the House of Commons. I haven't felt that my gender has been a barrier to achieving in the House of Commons or getting anything done. And I feel I've fitted in. And actually, I would probably say that's probably more to do with who I am rather than what gender I am.
But while Kelly doesn't feel her gender has held her back, that's not to say there isn't a certain amount of backlash aimed at women in politics, and that's something Vera would definitely have recognised.
Yeah, you're right. The NUWSS faced local opposition from campaign groups like her mother's, but also in the local press. In fact, in September 1912, the Chatham Observer published a cartoon headed "The Spread of the Sex Wars," commenting on the movement being anti-men.
Of course, today people have the ability to comment globally and directly thanks to the rise of the internet.
Where I do think that women have been particularly targeted is around this abuse and the social media.
Being trolled online.
Yeah, and it is misogyny. And actually, I've experienced it in the mainstream media. So I would say that if you look at every national newspaper article that's been written about me as a minister, actually it's been misogynistic, rather than actually just talking about me and my policy.
What sort of things would they say?
Well, commenting on the way I look, commenting on the way I speak, on my hair or something like that, as opposed to actually what I'm talking about. I would say as well, I've got a Medway accent, I've come from here, I've got a Thames Estuary accent, and actually it's really interesting. Well, I always say...
I'm proud of how I
Well,
sound.
and so am I, because I always say, well, you know what? I sound like the people I represent. I've been very lucky in the sense that, and I say lucky, but touch word, I've had abuse, but it's actually not been anything like what some of my female colleagues have had. I'm really pleased I'm the MP. I'm so pleased I'm doing it. I'm proud of the fact that I've done it. But actually, knowing what I know now about that side of it, I would think twice if I'd realised how nasty, there's no other word to describe it really, how nasty it is. And it is very personal. It's definitely been a factor for some. And actually, it's something that I think puts women off, particularly going into politics.
But despite the challenges, women have certainly made their mark on politics since Vera Conway Gordon's time. So the first woman elected to Parliament was Constance Markievicz, that was in 1918. And then a year later, the first woman to take a seat was Nancy Astor. 1929, it was the first female cabinet minister, and that was Labour's Margaret Bonfield. That's good
pub
old
fact,
pub,
that is.
good for pub quizzes, that one. And of course, we've had 3 female prime ministers, Margaret Thatcher, Theresa May and Liz Truss, and they were all Conservatives. So I asked Lauren why she thinks we haven't even seen a female leader of the Labour Party yet.
I think it's just about sometimes challenging those views of what a leader is. I certainly heard during the last leadership election that Keir Starmer very much looked like a leader. He does, but that's also a very narrow view of what a leader is. Somebody with a legal background, somebody who's, white, of a certain age. We need to have a broader definition of what a leader looks like, because there are lots of women out there who are leading in their communities, and they might not necessarily, look the part, but you can't just think about who looks like our good leaders previously.
As we've been saying, 100 years on, we haven't had this conversation, which is disappointing at one level. Move on 10 years, 30 years. Do you think we would have to have the same conversation, or do you hope that it might be different?
I think we probably would still have to have the same conversation, but I think things would be better. In the same way that you could have had this conversation in the 1990s when I was growing up. But things were much worse then. You think about when I grew up with, kind of lads mags culture and everything, and I was a young feminist then, sort of in my teens, and it felt much more isolating. You felt like you were a lone voice. Whereas now, when I speak to young people, particularly young women, but also young men as well, they have better attitudes towards healthy relationships, to how women should be treated. I mean, there's been a bit of a backslide recently with Andrew Tate and some of the misogyny that you see online, but broadly, I think we're in a better place. So I think it will be an ongoing fight towards greater gender equality. But I think I'm hopeful for the future, because I look at that younger generation, what they call Gen Z, Gen Alpha, and I think, they're a lot more progressive and just less rigid about things like gender identity and what have you. And I just think, well, we'll probably still be having the conversation, but things will be better.
And things are certainly looking better for the suffrage garden on the Esplanade in Rochester. After months and months of work, Natalie and the Force volunteers are now looking forward to a major celebration over the summer.
We're planning that the makeover will be complete late this summer, completely planted out. But of course, gardens, they change with the seasons, and different plantings happen with different plants. So 2 years ago, we planted runner beans in the garden, which just were wonderful. So we had pyramid canes and red and green runner beans up there. And then last year we had red sunflowers. So the garden will change over periods of time and different seasons. But yes, it'll be complete this year, and we're hoping to have a grand opening to celebrate Vera's work and life and declare the garden open.
You can find out more about the garden, the grand reopening, and how you can get involved with the monthly volunteer days on the Suffrage Sensory Garden Rochester Facebook page. We'd add a link to it in the show notes.
Thanks as ever to the City of Rochester Society for supporting this podcast. You can find out more about all their activities at city-of-rochester.org.uk.
And thank you so much for listening to We Did It Medway. Make sure you like and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts so you never miss an episode, and remember to tell all your friends about us too.